My estate goes to Rex. The lawyer, Mr. Henderson's deep, monotonous voice echoed through the conference room of Henderson and Associates in Harmony Creek, Ohio. The sound of those words, so unexpected, was followed by a muffled laugh, almost a snort, that broke the respectful silence that should have permeated the reading of a will. I, Abigail, at 68 years old, and my heart already broken by the loss of my beloved George, felt as if the ground had opened beneath my feet. Rex, our golden retriever, the sweetest and most loyal dog that ever lived, would be the sole heir to George's entire fortune. Everyone laughed. And worse, they laughed at me. My own family, George's distant relatives who barely visited him and who now huddled in the room, reveled in my humiliation. That day, which should have been one of mourning and farewell, turned into my worst pain, a spectacle of cruelty and scorn. I had dedicated 45 years of my life to George. We built a home, a life, a legacy of love and companionship in the small town of Harmony Creek, a place where everyone knew each other and gossip spread faster than the local creek. And now, the only thing he left me was public shame and the responsibility of a will that seemed like a bad joke. But I didn't know that this was just the first layer of a story no one could have predicted. If you've ever felt the pain of betrayal or public humiliation, you know that life can surprise us in unexpected ways. If this story has already touched your heart, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters of this journey. Can still feel the heat of shame rising up my neck as the looks of pity and mockery followed me out of the lawyer's office. The whispers, "Poor Abigail, what an outrage." George was always eccentric, were like fine needles piercing my dignity. My mind reeled, trying to process the magnitude of that affront. How could George, the man I loved, have done such a thing? Was it an act of love for Rex, or a final cruel joke at my expense? The uncertainty was a slow poison, corroding what little peace I had left, and leaving me adrift in a sea of unanswered questions. The feeling of being a helpless widow, not just from the death of my husband, but from his last will, was unbearable. I, who had always been the rock of our family, now found myself a ship adrift, with a broken compass and an uncertain destination. With every step out of that building, I felt the weight of the stairs and the certainty that my life in Harmony Creek would never be the same. The gossip would spread like wildfire, and I would forever be the woman whose husband left everything to the dog. I returned home, to the house that now, legally, belonged to a dog. Rex, oblivious to all the commotion and drama unfolding around his new heir status, wagged his tail at the door, his brown eyes full of innocent joy. He was the only thing left of George that still brought me some comfort, a living link to the man I loved. George and I met in college in Boston in the 70s, a brilliant engineer, always with his head in the clouds, dreaming of inventions and projects. I, a literature teacher passionate about books, who found in his eccentricity a safe haven. Our life together was a tapestry of simple, happy moments, picnics in the park, movie nights at home, building our rose garden that was the envy of all the neighbors in Harmony Creek. We never had children, and Rex, whom we adopted 10 years ago from a local shelter, filled that void with his energy and unconditional love. George was always a man of few words but grand gestures. I remember when he built an entire bookshelf for me by hand, because I had complained that I no longer had space for my novels, or when he surprised me with a trip to the Grand Canyon, just because I had mentioned I always wanted to see it. He was my safe harbor, my best friend, and the idea that he could have planned this final humiliation tore me apart. The pain of losing George was immense, but the confusion and feeling of betrayal were almost worse. How could the man who loved me expose me to such scorn? But looking at Rex, lying at my feet, his head resting on his paws, I felt a pang of something stronger than pain. Determination. Rex was not to blame for anything. He was an innocent creature and I would not abandon him. If George wanted me to take care of him, then I would. But it wouldn't be easy. George's relatives, led by his sister, Aunt Mildred, were already making their moves. Mildred, a sharp-tongued woman with boundless ambition, saw George's fortune as hers by right. She had already insinuated that I was a gold-digging widow, and that George had finally seen the truth about me. The whole town seemed to be watching, each neighbor with their own theory about the dog's will. I knew I would have to fight. Fight for George's memory, fight for Rex, and above all, fight for my own dignity. Little Harmony Creek, which was once my refuge, now seemed like a stage where my life was being enacted for public scrutiny. But I was not a woman to give up. I was Abigail, the woman who had faced life head-on for almost 7 decades, and an eccentric will would not bring me down. I refused to be the dog's widow without a fight. The legal battle began almost immediately. Aunt Mildred, with her impeccably suited lawyer and cynical smile, tried everything to annul the will. She claimed insanity, undue influence, anything that could disqualify George's last wishes. I, on the other hand, with the help of the young and idealistic local lawyer, David Miller, defended the document's validity. David, a recent graduate of the University of Michigan, and with a sparkle in his eyes that reminded me of young George, fervently believed in justice and the will of the deceased. He argued that George was always eccentric, but never insane, and that his love for Rex was as genuine as any family bond. As the dispute dragged on in the county courts, life in Harmony Creek became increasingly difficult. Curious glances turned into open judgments. Some saw me as a victim, others as a woman who was getting what she deserved for not having children, an antiquated belief that still persisted in some corners of the town. The house, once filled with laughter and the smell of apple pie, now seemed like a mausoleum of memories and silences. My only constant companion was Rex, who seemed to sense the tension in the air. He followed me from room to room, lying at my feet as I read or tried to sort through the piles of legal papers. His joyful bark was the only sound that broke the melancholy that had settled in my home. It was then that the unthinkable happened. One Tuesday morning, the sun had barely risen over the hills of Harmony Creek. I woke up and Rex was not in his bed. I called his name, searched throughout the house, in the garden, in the neighborhood. Nothing. The gate was closed. There were no signs of forced entry. He had simply vanished, as if he had evaporated into thin air. Panic hit me like a cold wave, stronger than any pain I had ever felt. That will, which once seemed like a curse, now turned into a real and urgent concern. If Rex disappeared, all of George's fortune could go into Mildred's hands. A woman I knew had no scruples. But more than the money, it was the loss of my last link to George. The loss of my loyal companion. That desperate me. I called the police, animal shelters, put up posters all over town with Rex's photo, and the promise of a generous reward. David, my lawyer, temporarily suspended the legal battle to help me in the search. Harmony Creek, which once judged me, now united in a community search for Rex, showing that despite the gossip, there was still a caring heart in the town. But days turned into weeks, and Rex remained missing. Hope began to dwindle, replaced by a growing fear. Where could my beloved Rex be? And what, or who, was behind his mysterious disappearance? With each passing day, the feeling that something much darker and more premeditated was at play intensified, and I knew I needed to find the truth, not just for Rex, but for George and for myself. The weeks without Rex dragged on like years. Each dawn brought a new wave of despair, each dusk, the shadow of fear. Harmony Creek, which once seemed like a refuge, had now become a labyrinth of painful memories. I spent my days putting up new posters, distributing flyers, and talking to everyone I met, hoping for a clue. David, my young lawyer, had become an invaluable ally, not only in the legal battle but in the search for Rex. He organized volunteer groups, scoured social media, and even contacted a private detective, a former Cleveland police officer, who specialized in missing pet cases, Aunt Mildred. Meanwhile, never missed an opportunity to torment me. Poor Rex, she would say with a fake smile. He probably ran off to a better place, away from all this commotion. Maybe he knew he didn't belong. Her words were like knives, but I refused to give in. I knew Rex wouldn't run away. He was loyal, and his disappearance was far more sinister than a simple escape. It was on a rainy autumn afternoon, as I walked along the forest trail that George and I used to frequent, that a small glimmer of hope appeared. The trail, which led to a secluded creek, was one of Rex's favorite spots. I was almost giving up, with muddy boots and a heavy heart, when I saw something shining among the wet leaves. It was a small leather collar, not Rex's, but a cat collar with a fish-shaped charm. It was old, worn, and seemed to have been abandoned there a long time ago. But what would a cat collar be doing so far from town, in a place where Rex loved to play? The collar wasn't Rex's, but its presence there in that specific spot intrigued me. George and I never had cats, and Rex, despite tolerating other animals, wasn't one to play with felines. I picked up the collar, feeling a shiver down my spine. It seemed like a clue, however small, a loose thread in a web of mystery. I took it to David, who examined the charm with a magnifying glass. "Abigail, this is interesting," he said. "The charm has an engraving, Luna, and an old phone number, from an area that no longer exists. The clue was fragile, but it was the first we had. That small, seemingly insignificant object rekindled the flame of hope in my heart. I knew I was on the right track, and that the truth about Rex's disappearance was closer than I imagined. The cat collar with the name Luna and the old phone number became my obsession. David, with his research expertise, managed to trace the number to an old Harmony Creek phone line that had been deactivated more than 20 years ago. The line belonged to an isolated property, an old, dilapidated house on the outskirts of town, known locally as the Miller House. A family who had mysteriously moved away decades ago. No one dared to go there, and the house was surrounded by legends and ghost stories. Despite David's warnings and my own apprehension, I knew I had to go. My grandmotherly instinct, which I never had the chance to exercise with human children, told me that Rex was in danger, and that this abandoned house held the key to the mystery. I armed myself with a flashlight, pepper spray, courtesy of David, who insisted I take something to defend myself, and the determination of a lion. The house was a wooden skeleton, with broken windows and an overgrown garden. The air was heavy, laden with the smell of mold and abandonment. As I searched the dusty rooms, calling Rex's name, I felt a presence. It wasn't a ghost, but something alive, hidden in the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest, and the pepper spray felt heavy in my hand. It was then that I heard a cry, a faint, frightening sound coming from the basement. I descended the creaking stairs, the flashlight trembling in my hands. The basement was dark and damp, with cobwebs covering every corner. And there, huddled in a corner, was Rex. My heart filled with relief and joy, but the joy was short-lived. Beside Rex, there was something else. A small figure, wrapped in a dirty blanket, that stirred slightly at the sound of my arrival. It wasn't an animal. It was a child. A girl of perhaps 6 or 7, with dark hair and large, frightened eyes. She was thin, dirty, and seemed to have lived there for a long time. Rex, who was visibly thinner but unharmed, licked the girl's face as if protecting her. The will said, "My estate goes to Rex." Everyone laughed until the day the dog disappeared. When we found him, he was with someone who shouldn't exist. And there she was, a child no one in Harmony Creek knew, living in an abandoned house, protected by my dog. The shock of finding a child in the abandoned house was overwhelming. My mind, which had prepared to find Rex, or perhaps even Aunt Mildred in some trap, now struggled to process the image of that fragile girl. She huddled even closer when she saw me, burying her face in Rex's fur, who growled softly, a protective warning. "Don't worry, sweetie," I said, my voice trying to be as gentle as possible. "I won't hurt you. I'm Abigail, and this is Rex." Slowly, the girl lifted her head, her large dark eyes watching me with a mixture of fear and curiosity. She didn't say a word, but her eyes seemed to carry the pain of a lifetime. Rex, sensing my intention, licked her hand, as if encouraging her. I offered her a piece of granola bar that I had brought for Rex, and she took it with trembling hands, eating ravenously. As she ate, I noticed something around her neck, a small cat collar, exactly like the one I had found in the forest. The fish-shaped charm, with the name Luna engraved. "Luna?" I asked, pointing to the collar. The girl nodded, and for the first time, a sound came from her mouth, an almost inaudible whisper. "My cat, she's gone." The connection formed in my mind. The collar in the forest, the abandoned house, the girl named Luna. She wasn't the cat, but the cat's owner, and Rex somehow had found this lost child and was protecting her. With David's help, who arrived shortly after, alerted by my delay, we took Luna to the hospital. She was malnourished and dehydrated, but physically unharmed. While the doctors examined her, David began to investigate. The abandoned house, the Miller family, the local legend. The story he unearthed was darker than any legend. The Miller family had disappeared decades ago, but not without leaving a trace. The house had been the scene of a crime, a kidnapping, and the girl, Luna, was the Miller's missing daughter, who had been presumed dead for over 20 years. The revelation hit me like a lightning bolt. Luna wasn't just a lost child. She was the missing piece of an old puzzle, a secret buried deep in Harmony Creek. And Rex, my faithful Rex, had been the instrument of fate, the link between past and present. That eccentric will of George's, which seemed like a cruel joke, now took on new meaning. George, with his brilliant mind and generous heart, had planned everything. He knew about Luna. He knew about the secret of the abandoned house. And he had used Rex as his messenger, his guardian, to ensure the truth came out. George's revenge wasn't against me, but against injustice, against oblivion. And I, Abigail, was about to discover my husband's true legacy. The revelation that Luna was the missing Miller daughter, and that George somehow was involved, turned Harmony Creek upside down. The hospital, once a place of silence and recovery, became a hub of chatter and speculation. David, my lawyer, worked tirelessly, delving into the town's old archives and interviewing the few residents who still remembered the Miller tragedy. The story was heartbreaking. The Millers, a young and promising family, had disappeared without a trace 25 years ago, leaving behind only an empty house and the legend of an unsolved kidnapping. Luna, who was only 2 at the time, was presumed dead. As Luna recovered, gaining weight and a little color, she began to speak. Her first words were about Rex, her 4-legged angel, who had protected her and fed her with scraps of food he found. She described a solitary life in the abandoned house, surviving on what she could hunt and what Rex brought her. But the most shocking thing was when she mentioned a kind man who visited her occasionally, bringing food and blankets, and who always brought a large golden dog. "He told me stories," Luna whispered, "and said that one day I would be free." My heart froze. The kind man could only be George. But how? Why had he never told me? The pain of betrayal, which I had felt on the day the will was read, returned, but now mixed with deep confusion. George, my husband, the man I thought I knew so well, had kept a monumental secret for over 2 decades. David, with a serious look, handed me a folder. "Abigail, I found this in the county archives. George Miller, Luna's father, was George's best friend, your husband. They grew up together here in Harmony Creek. George Miller was your wedding best man." The pieces began to fit together, painfully. George had promised his friend he would take care of Luna, should anything happen. When the Miller tragedy struck, George, my George, had kept his promise, in his peculiar way. He had found Luna, perhaps years after the disappearance, and had protected her in secret, fearing that the truth could put her in danger again. Aunt Mildred, upon learning of Luna's existence, changed her tactics. Now she claimed Luna was an imposter, a wild child with no right to George's inheritance. But David was prepared. He had Luna's testimony, the cat collar with the name Luna, and the old phone number, and more importantly, George's will, which, by leaving everything to Rex, indirectly protected Luna, knowing that I, Abigail, would take care of the dog and, by extension, the girl he protected. George had not humiliated me. He had entrusted me with the most important secret of his life, and the responsibility of a justice he could not openly seek. The story of Luna and George's secret legacy spread like wildfire through Harmony Creek and beyond. Local and even national media began covering the case, turning the small town into the epicenter of a decades-old mystery. Public pressure and overwhelming evidence forced authorities to reopen the Miller case. David, with the help of detectives and forensic experts, uncovered the truth behind the Miller family's disappearance. The kidnapping of Luna and the disappearance of her parents were not the work of strangers, but of an envious neighbor, a man named Silas Blackwood, who coveted the Miller's land. He had murdered Luna's parents and held her captive for a time, before abandoning her in the isolated house, believing she would starve or be taken by wild animals. George, who never believed the official version of the disappearance, had investigated on his own, silently, for years. He had found Luna, living as a wild child, and, unable to expose Silas without concrete evidence and fearing for the girl's safety, decided to protect her in secret, visiting her and ensuring her survival. George's will, which seemed like an eccentricity, was actually a masterpiece of ingenuity. By leaving everything to Rex, he knew that I, Abigail, would never abandon the dog. And by taking care of Rex, I would inevitably find Luna, the true heir to his love and his quest for justice. George had planted the seeds of truth, and Rex, with his unwavering loyalty, had been the catalyst for that truth to blossom. Silas Blackwood was arrested, and justice, though delayed, was finally served to the Miller family. Luna, now 27, but with the mind and body of a child who had lost years of development, began her long journey of recovery. She was officially recognized as the Miller's daughter, and George's inheritance, which included not only the house but also a considerable fortune in investments, was legally transferred to a fund in her name. Aunt Mildred, defeated and humiliated, disappeared from Harmony Creek, taking with her only the community's scorn. I, Abigail, became Luna's legal guardian, her adoptive grandmother, her mentor. Rex, my faithful companion, continued to be her protector, her link to the past and her guide to the future. The house, once a symbol of mourning and shame, became a home of healing and hope. George, my George, had left me the greatest legacy of all. Not money, but a mission. A chance to redeem a life and to find a renewed purpose in my own. 5 years have passed since Luna was found, and Harmony Creek has never been the same. The Miller house, once a place of dark legends, was renovated and became a community center for vulnerable children, a project conceived by Luna and funded with part of George's inheritance. Luna, now a young woman of 32, with a smile that lit up any room, dedicated her life to helping other children find a home and hope. She had overcome unimaginable traumas, and her resilience was an inspiration to all. I, Abigail, at 73, found a new purpose. I became the director of the community center, sharing my stories and my love for literature with the children. Rex, now an elderly dog, but still full of vitality, was the center's mascot, receiving affection from all the children and serving as a living reminder of the extraordinary story that united us. David Miller, my lawyer, became a dear friend and an honorary member of our family. He and Luna, over time, developed a special connection, and I couldn't help but smile seeing them together, building a future that George somehow had foreseen. George, my beloved George, had left me a legacy that went far beyond any will. He taught me that true love is not limited to life, that justice can be patient, and that family can be found in the most unexpected places. The pain of the initial humiliation had turned into pride, the confusion into clarity, and the loneliness into a vibrant, loving family. Sometimes, when the sun sets over Harmony Creek, I sit in my rose garden, with Rex at my feet and Luna by my side, and I think of George. He was a man of secrets, yes, but his secrets were acts of love, of a depth I could only understand after his passing. He left me Rex, and Rex brought me Luna, and Luna brought me a new dawn. If you were moved by the journey of Abigail, Luna, and Rex, if this story made you reflect on the true meaning of family and justice, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more soul-touching stories. What part surprised you the most? Leave your comment below.